We are in your United States History book, Chapter 17, Session 3. We're going to talk about the President Grant and President Hayes and their administrations at this time, which was during the Reconstruction of the South, and the end of presidential Reconstruction would go into congressional Reconstruction. Congress would take over for reconstructing the South. And there would be a compromise of 1877, which would end the Reconstruction period. So remember that date is 1877. Here's a picture, of course, of President Grant, President Hayes, and we have here the president shaking hands. In the midst we have Grant and Lee as the surrender here, which is very important, but now we'd have to deal with the North and the South and Reconstruction, and Grant would actually become one of the presidents of this period of time. The Grant administration in 1868. In 1868 now, remember in 1865 is the end of the war, and President Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson became president, but now is a new election in 1868. And the Republicans now nominated the hero Ulysses S. Grant, who became the greatest general during especially of the North during the Civil War. And a lot of people looked up to Grant. Democrats then nominated Horatio Seymour, who was the former governor of New York. So anyway, here's Colfax. Colfax was ran for vice president. So we have Grant and Colfax running. But Horatio Seymour ran against him, but Grant won. They say mainly people think he won because the freemen were allowed to vote. The ex-slaves were allowed to vote. But Grant was a national hero and respected. He was upright and honest. He was sympathetic to the South and desired so much to reunite the country. His total heart was to heal the wounds of war, which he had saw, throughout all, whether from the Battle of Vicksburg in the Tennessee onto seeing what happened in Gettysburg. Grant was involved in the atrocities of war too. But he was held back by the opposition of Congress and certain scandals. And we'll talk about those scandals. Certain scandals happened while he was president, and it was due to some dishonest businessmen and government officials in his administration that he didn't attend to. So a lot of time when you talk about the Grant administration, when President Grant was president, people say, oh, it wasn't a very good time. Did you look at all those scandals? Yet, let alone the president was not involved in any of the scandals, but his name would be tainted because of it. So the Grant administration is going to start in 1868. Ulysses S. Grant, he lived 1822 to 1885. His name was not Ulysses S. Grant. It was Hiram Ulysses Grant. But when he went to school at West Point, the military academy, they actually had his name S with that extra S in the middle, and S didn't stand for anything, he thought. Maybe his wife's maiden name, but he just kept that because it meant, so it looked like it said United States, Ulysses S, but he left it. But his real name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. He was born in Ohio. His father ran a tannery. In 1839, his father arranged for his son, actually spent all that he had to try to get his son admitted to West Point. In 1843, he did graduate from West Point, and he became a skilled horseman. Grant was always good with horses. He always was riding a horse. In almost all these pictures, you have him riding a horse into battle, or riding the horse to lead the battle. That was Grant. He married Julia Barrick in Missouri, and she was a sister of one of his friends at West Point. She was a daughter of a merchant, but the merchant had slaves, right? We're talking about Missouri being then a slave state, so they had slaves. But when he married her and he actually inherited this part, basically inheriting these slaves, Grant set these slaves free. he worked with them, and he did not believe in slavery. In fact, his parents were abolitionists, and you'll find his parents involved radically in the abolition movement in the North, abolish slavery in the North. So he and his wife had different lives. But Julia, it's evident, she agreed with them, and they let the slaves go. Grant also fought in the Mexican-American War. He was a very unsuccessful farmer later on. After the war, he fought in the war. He came back as, veteran of the war, whatever. He disliked the Mexican-American War, such as what he was in, and he tried to be a farmer. He flunked as a farmer. He was not a good farmer, and then he tried as a businessman, and he flunked that twice as much as he did as a farmer. So everything he put his hand to do in business flopped, let's just say that. And so then the Civil War started, and he volunteered to go to war under the 21st Volunteers. So he's a volunteer. So later, he was under Halleck at first, but later they see how Lincoln brought into Lincoln, making him a brigadier general at this point. We saw how he flourished as a general and leading these battles. He captured some cities in Tennessee, onto Vicksburg. He had many victories, and President Lincoln was cheering him, and he called him Unconditional Surrender Grant, because basically Grant at that time, General Grant, said, no, I'm not going to have any conditions, you just need to surrender. And so everyone called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. So he was indeed a hero in the Civil War, a hero general. He was put in total charge. Lincoln put him in total charge. In fact, it was at Appomattox that General Robert E. Lee of the South surrendered to Grant. And in fact, Grant looked at Lee, he gave him some lenience, gave his sword back to him, and Grant did not arrest the General Lee. He actually saw General Lee as a military genius, although Ulysses S. Grant, General Grant, was a genius, military genius also. So, and then 5 days later, what happened? After 5 days later, after Lee surrenders to Grant, on April 14th, what happens? Can you guess? President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in the theater. This actor comes in the back, shoots President Abraham Lincoln, jumps off, runs away. And they ended up finding out that it was a conspiracy, not just with Wilkes Booth, but quite a few other people involved in all of this. But anyway, so the thing about this that I thought was very, very interesting was that Ulysses Grant and his wife, General Grant and his wife, they were invited by President Lincoln to be with them at the theater that night. And you wonder why. Well, they were actually, his wife, Julia, which is Grant's wife, she decided that she wanted to go visit her family, her son, so they were going to leave. But we find out really that Julia, she was not fond at all of Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife. She did not like her. So she didn't want to go to a theater with her. So she basically told Grant she didn't want to go. So they did not go. Now later on, Grant says, I wish I would have been there. I would have been able to protect President Lincoln. Grant really, really looked up to President Abraham Lincoln. And he would, of course, this was one of the saddest days in our history to see a president like Lincoln assassinated. So, but it was just a tidbit there that, Grant was supposed to be there. And he wasn't there. His wife didn't really want to be there. So anyway, Grant was a national hero. He was our only 4-star general. So Grant, think of only 4-star general. He was a national hero. In 1868, Grant resigned from his Secretary of War under Johnson. So we had Abraham Lincoln, and then Johnson became president. He was vice president, became president because Lincoln was assassinated. And Grant was put under the Secretary of War as Johnson got rid of his other Secretary of War, which was a tenure that they would try to impeach him about. But then Grant resigned. He didn't want anything to do with this. And I'm not sure that Grant really liked President Johnson so well. In fact, he didn't want to be aligned with him. So the election at that time, this election in 1868, Grant won 214 electoral votes to only 18 votes from Seymour. That's a big difference anyway. So it was almost like a landslide that Grant would win. And Ulysses S. Grant now would be the youngest president ever up until that time. He was only 46 years old, and he'd become the president of the United States. Then Grant, as president, he would be reelected in 1872. 4 years passed. He probably could have been reelected to a third term, but he decided not to do that. But he was reelected because everyone still looked at him as a national hero. So Grant did sign the 15th Amendment and supported pardons for the South. So he did both. He signed the 15th Amendment. He was for reconstructing the South and helping the freedmen. And he also was in for pardoning the South for Reconstruction. He wanted basically the Union to be united. A couple other little tidbits he did here. He started the National Weather Service, and he opened Yellowstone Park as a national park. Two things. I didn't know those. In 1872, he won the election, 286 electoral votes to 66 votes against Horace Greeley, another guy from New York. But like I said before, there were two major scandals that were during this time of Grant's administration. One was James Fisk and Jay Gould, and they manipulated the gold market so that they would have a panic of September 24th, 1869. They called this day Black Friday. So during this time it became harsh when these two high bankers, I could say very wealthy men, would manipulate to bring a panic about, which now is even called like Black Friday. Also, they had a whiskey ring in 1875 that defrauded millions of dollars in liquor tax. And so here we have two great scandals going on, and there was a couple more. So during Grant's presidency, we can look back and see, he wasn't implemented in any of these, but they did go on. And after Grant left the White House, he took a 2-year trip around the world. And dignitaries and cheering crowds, wherever he went, came out and cheered Grant and his family wherever he went. But then he came back later. Grant was swindled out of his investments. He had investments, and of course he was pretty wealthy. But he went through some investments that his son put together, actually that he was swindled. There was a swindler that actually swindled Grant out of all his money, and he actually became bankrupt at this point. So here we have a great president, national hero, becoming bankrupt. Like I said before, he had limited business ability, right? Well, but he decided at this time, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. Why do you think throat cancer? Well, because he smoked cigars constantly. You have pictures, especially during the war, and he always had a cigar in his mouth, right? Well, he got, 1884, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, and so he decided at this point to settle down and write his memoirs. So he wrote everything all about the war. He has 2 large memoirs of material, and the writer, which was very famous at the time, even famous today, his name's Mark Twain. He wrote Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and all that, Well, Mark Twain decided to publish Grant's memoirs, and he would make more money at his memoirs than anything he did in history, although he ended up dying at the age of 63, right after he finished his memoirs, and never would see this. But his family would be blessed, Julie and his family would be blessed by his memoirs that he left. Quite a deal. So Grant's memoirs. Here's a picture of Grant's memoirs. That's his life. Personal memoirs of U.S. Grant. The friend of my adversary. Okay, this is great. This is a great quote. I love this quote. He says, the friend in my adversary. Oh, let's start again. The friend in my adversity I shall always cherish most. I can better trust those who have helped relieve the gloom of my dark hours than those who are so ready to enjoy with me the sunshine of my prosperity. Don't you love that? He's saying, I'll always remember my friends when things were dark and gloomy, and when I had much adversity. I will always remember those friends the most than those friends that were with me in the sunshine. So that was his last memoir, President Grant. So let's go on here. We have the election now coming of 1876. Of course, people wanted Grant to run another term, and he decided not to. So now they have this election of 1876 was the closest race in history up to this time. And plus, this election, a lot of people think it was a voter fraud election. So, it's just by what happened because they never really knew which president, as for the states that were in discrepancy. Let's talk about it. So the Democratic candidate was Samuel J. Tilden of New York, governor of New York. Here's a picture of him right here. Tilden was really famous in New York because he smashed this whole bribery scheme, the Tweed Ring. They stole $1.5 million from New York, from the state of New York, and he smashed the ring. So he was known as basically famous as a hero in getting rid of these bribery, these schemes, and these things that were going on in the midst of the dark times of that time, schemes and bribery and all this. But anyway, so here we have Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, 1822 to 1893 is when he lived. He's the Republican candidate. And his honest desire was to end permanently the destruction between the North and South and to unite a country. His heart was to unite the country together. And so was actually Tilden's. And so both of them were pretty reputable, right? Tilden seemed to have won then. So what Tilden they thought should have been president. He seemed to have won. And even Hayes conceded and said, okay, he won, he's president. But there were 4 states that were disputed very closely. Oregon, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, they had to be counted again. And so the Republicans ended up winning all 4 of those states. Well, then the Democrats thought that the votes were tainted, but they weren't sure, so there was a constitutional crisis because they appointed electoral commission to decide because it was equal. There was equal Democrats, equal Republicans, and there was one guy that was an independent, and he decided not to do the job. So they ended up getting a Republican to replace him. And during this whole thing with this replacement, the decision was made that Hayes would be elected president. So it was a very confusing election. Let's see, the election of 1876, very confusing election. So the Republican won, which would be Rutherford B. Hayes, but the Democrats thought, well, we should go probably in legality, we should fight this. But they decided not to fight this if there were certain concessions that they would have Hayes to do for them. Number 1, Hayes was to appoint 1 Southerner to his cabinet, which he did. He didn't think it was a big idea. And then number 2, the federal money available would be spent to develop the Southern economy. Of course, Hayes didn't think that was a bad deal. Of course, he wanted to develop the Southern economy. But number 3 said that all Northern troops would have to be removed from the South. That was actually the biggest problem because if they removed the troops, how are they going to be able to control what goes on in the South, especially dealing with the freedmen and the issues that they had come out of slavery and the persecution against them. They thought they needed troops down there, Northern troops, to basically take care of situations that were coming to be in the South. So in 1877, this would be considered the Compromise of 1877. So President Hayes was peaceably admitted as President of the United States without the Democrats, getting behind and suing him, or legally pursuing, saying that there was a problem with the votes in these states. They conceded and basically said if Hayes did all three of these things. And so the troops were removed, and this would mark the end of the Reconstruction period altogether. So this is the Compromise of 1877. It settled the election dispute and included lots of favors to the South. The new government would be given more aid to the South, and all the remaining federal troops would leave the South. There would be no federal troops in the South. And the Democrats promised to maintain African American rights. So this was the compromise, and Hayes signed it. President Hayes signed it. The Southern experience of Reconstruction. So let's stop there. We'll do this last video, and we're going to talk about how the Reconstruction really went, and a few people that were actually heroes during this time. So let's go on to the next video.